Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, fellow, here at the ISS and editor of our Adelphi book series. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this discussion webinar about our newest Adelphi book, Evaluating Japan's New Grand Strategy, written by our own ISS Japan chair, Robert Ward, who is here with us today. Institute members, of course, will receive a copy of the book, and all participants on this webinar should later receive an email with a 20% discount code for Routledge, which you can also access if you wish to by using the QR code, which you'll see behind my head virtually there and behind Robert's head. The book is available to buy on Amazon and, of course, on Kindle as well. Firstly, I want to thank Robert profoundly for his work on this book. It was a real pleasure bringing it with him into the world. I also want to thank my ISS colleagues across various teams in editorial, design, communication, and events, especially, of course, Associate Editor Alice Averson and our designer, Alessandra Belufi. I also want to extend a special thanks to our colleague, Konishi Mina, and particularly to her father, Konishi Takuya, who generously created some original and beautiful calligraphy using antique ink, which we were then, or rather Alessandra was then able to integrate digitally onto the cover in this lovely way. So just a little about the format today. Robert will first speak for about 15-20 minutes or so to introduce the book's main themes and arguments, and then we'll go into Q&A with the audience. So ahead of the Q&A for our online viewers, please type any questions or comments you might have into the chat function below on Zoom. And I should also note, of course, that this meeting is definitely on the record. Now let me introduce our author, Robert Ward. Robert is the ISS Japan chair, carrying out independent research and writing extensively on strategic issues relating to Japan, including its contemporary security and foreign policies. He also leads the Institute's Geoeconomics and Strategy Research Program, which focuses on a range of issues, including global economic governance, rules and standard settings, and how economic coercion impacts policy at a national and corporate level. Prior to joining the Institute in 2019, Robert was editorial director at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and in this capacity, he led the EIU's country and industry analysis and forecasting teams, and he was also a member of the EIU's executive committee. Robert lived and worked in Japan from 1989 to 1996, latterly holding a position in Japan's largest credit rating agency, the Japan Bond Research Institute, and he is a fluent Japanese speaker. And he also holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Cambridge University. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, on this very warm summer's day in the UK. First, a few thanks, actually, because the book wouldn't have been publishable but for the support of all the teams and all the people that you mentioned, Ben. But thanks to you, Ben, for trusting me to write for this series. And I was watching Joshua Rovner's Adelphi launch the other day, and listening to him reminded me when he was saying that the series is now 64 years old, and it's had a glittering series of authors, including Sir Michael Howard and from Japan, actually, the great international relations specialist Kosaka Masataka. So it's been a great privilege to be able to write for this series as well. Thanks to, as you said, Ben, to Alice and to Alessandra, to the Japan Chair team as well, who were very generous in their unstinting research support. And as you said, Ben, to Konishi Takuya for his absolutely wonderful calligraphy on the front, which sort of fills me with joy every time I see it. And also final thanks to all those who have appeared on our Japan Memo podcast, webinars, and so on, because there's a really rich store of opinion, analysis, and so on in those shows, which I drew on quite extensively for the book as well. So the thanks to everybody now done into the book. I've been associated with Japan now since about 1989. That's when I first went out to Japan and on the JET program. So one of the many who benefited from the JET program, quite an extraordinary tool of soft power for Japan. So I've been watching Japan for a long time, and what's going on now in terms of how Japan sees itself strategically, how the sort of changes in its defense posture, security policy, and so on really are very striking, particularly if you have a sort of longer perspective like I do. And from this extensive change, I had sort of two research questions sort of kept on bubbling up in my mind, and were the inspiration, if you like, for the book. One was the need that I had to explain to an outside audience, a sort of general audience, but certainly outside Japan, just why Japan is changing so quickly, and what is sort of the drivers of these of all these policy changes and so on, which I'll talk about a bit later. My sense, even now, that Japan is still misunderstood by many outside Japan. Not least in terms of how it sees its security, also of its importance to the sort of political West, if you like, as a sort of bulwark in Asia. So I wanted to sort of illuminate these changes, just to bring them to a wider audience outside, obviously within Japan, but also outside Japan. I open the book with a quote from the 2022 National Security Strategy, which sort of provides a framework for the analysis of the book. And when I first read it way back in December 2022, I was really struck by in the opening paragraphs of the framing of the security strategy. And it says, the quote I use is, "Japan's security environment is as severe and complex as it has ever been since the end of World War II." So that provided the kind of, if you like, the impetus for wanting to illuminate the changes to a broader audience. And then the second research question I had was to answer a personal question that I've long had about all of this, and that is what Japan is doing? So we have all the changes in themselves, which are interesting, but are all these changes enough to meet the challenges that Japan sees in its external environment within its definition of state power? Japan calls this, in the National Security Strategy, NSS, it calls it comprehensive state power, comprehensive national power. There are some pillars on which this rests: the diplomatic, defense, economic, technological, and intelligence capability. And this again provides the framework, the sort of organizational framework for the analysis. So in a nutshell, the purpose of the book, I think, is, and I hope the readers sort of get this, is to address Japan's strategic robustness broadly, and its agency. The existing analysis, an important point here, obviously a lot of coverage of all the changes that have happened, largely, I think, since Abe Shinzo's second administration, and obviously again since the 2022 NSS. But the existing analysis largely focuses on the changes themselves, rather because they're historic, obviously, rather than whether Japan is up to the challenge that it set itself more broadly. So this is why I think the book needed to be written. The book is also, in a sense, a continuation, a sort of a building on of our first Adelphi on the Japan chair team, which I think you can see that, co-authored between myself and former Japan chair colleague Yuka Koshino, where we looked at Japan's effectiveness as a geo-economic actor. This sort of draws out the lens, the focus a bit more broadly. Before I get into the analysis, of a couple of assumptions about that underpin the analysis, and also important disclaimers about what the book isn't, because I don't want to prompt difficult questions that I can't answer. The book assumes, and it's an important point, that Japan's southwest region, which again features looms very large in the 2022 National Security Strategy, is a key focus of Japan's strategic thinking at the moment. It also assumes that, given the importance of this region to Japan, that Japan would be one of the main geopolitical losers if Taiwan were to be coercively absorbed by the People's Republic of China. What it doesn't do is to seek to illuminate how Japan might respond to a spectrum of grey zone coercion against Taiwan by China. So please, nobody ask me about that, nor what role Japan might take in the event of a Taiwan contingency. These are unknowable until the situation arises or doesn't arise, and the permutations are infinite. So I think it's impossible to argue to answer that with serious analysis. And neither does it seek to debate in depth the merits and demerits of specific military kit or SDF, self-defense force deployments, and so on. So as I said, the first is unknowable, and the second is beyond my area of expertise. So I'm looking at the sort of strategic agency, if you like, of Japan in a very broad way, trying to fly at sort of 35,000 feet. So in terms of the analysis, the title of the book, as it says there, is Evaluating Japan's New Grand Strategy. And grand strategy, as I've been told on social media, is a very slippery term. So let me just illuminate how I define grand strategy, and in so doing, point you to again Joshua Rovner's superb Adelphi volume which was published last year. On grand strategy and strategy, very sort of excellent overview, and he defines grand strategy as a theory for making a country secure, so about winning the peace. And this is the definition that I've chosen for the analysis here. I talked about the framework a second ago, but within the book, the focus is there's a strong focus on Japan's geography, because I think this is an important element of why Japan has been undertaking all these changes, why Japan is important within the broader sort of supporting of the rules-based order, and so on. The book argues within this vein that Japan's geography gives it a unique role in the political West and a panoramic perspective of current changes. I also allude to the conceptualization which I think Japan has of itself as a maritime nation. I think this has always been obviously in the debate, of course, but I think under the late Abe Shinzo, in his second premiership in particular, Japan's sort of maritime nation, strategic thinking around the maritime aspect, I think really moved on in leaps and bounds. Within this sort of putting the sort of geo back into geopolitics, I have a quote from Spikeman, a US political scientist who died in 1943, so died quite a long time ago. But he talked about geography being the most fundamental factor in a country's foreign policy because it is the most permanent. In his book, The United States and the Balance of Power, he says, which I think is a rather sort of nice way of putting this, he says, ministers come and go, even dictators die, but mountain ranges stand undisturbed. So that's an important part of the analysis here. So just sort of cantering very quickly through the chapters to give you a sense of where the argument's going. On chapter 1, I just wanted to put what's going on now within Japanese strategic thinking in a historical perspective. So I start the chapter's called Japan's Shifting Strategic Compass, I think. And I look at this big strategic changing structural breaks in Japan's journey from the Meiji restoration in the middle of the 19th century to 2022. And I identify 4 phases here. We have Meiji maritime realism, when Japan belonged to the prevailing maritime order, which was led by the US and the UK, or the UK and the US in the initial phase. And then from World War I to 1945, of course, the continentalism, the cul-de-sac of continentalism, when Japan turned its back on the international order. And then after the Second World War and the defeat, the Yoshida pragmatism, so the Yoshida doctrine, economic realism, the return of Japan as a maritime state within the sort of economic parameters. And then Abe-san's structural break, 10, 12 years ago, which was focusing on the needs of Japan's geography, and I think led to the what I think is the end of the Yoshida doctrine with the 2022 National Security Strategy. I also had to have a brief look at because it's so important within Japan's strategic thinking, at the Japan's position within the US, China, Russia, Soviet triangle, and how difficult it's been for Japan to achieve its goal at times of equidistance, and of course between the three, and this of course still vexes Japan's policymakers now. So in the subsequent chapters, I structure them around the contours of how Japan defines its own national power, which I mentioned earlier, as comprehensive national power. And these are, just to remind you, the 5 capability pillars are diplomatic, defense, economic, technological, and intelligence. So in chapter 2, I move to the changes in Japan's deterrence and response capabilities. These have obviously had a lot of attention analytically because there's so much change going on, and obviously the budgets are very high, and many other sort of associated things that are important. As I said earlier, it highlights the importance of the southwestern region of Japan. Important point is that the westernmost bit of Japan, Yonaguni Island, is only 100 kilometers away from Taiwan. So on a clear day, you can see it, apparently. So it is very, very close. So you understand why this region is so strategically important for Japan. Also talk about the strategic and logistical challenge for Japan, given this focus on the south, this new focus on the southwest region. The whole region is mainly maritime. It obviously includes Okinawa Prefecture. It is as long as the main island of Honshu, which has the key cities of Tokyo and Osaka on it. So it's a very, very sort of elongated piece of territory. And Ishigaki Island in the region, it's about 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo. So you get a sense of the logistical challenge for Japan in having this as a focus. As outlined in the 2022 NSS, Japan also now assumes responsibility for its own defense, and pledges to do this in the early 30s, and I quote, much earlier and at a further distance from Japan. And those of you that know Japan well will know what a change this is for strategically. In the words of one scholar whom I quote, Japan is committing itself to a forward-leaning denial strategy. Counter-strike capability is another eye-catching new introduction in the NSS. Again, there's obviously major challenges around that too. Active cyber defense, building up of defense industrial resilience. There's already some important advances there with the initiatives of the GCAP project, which involves Japan, Italy, and the UK. The launch of the Defense Industrial Corporation Acquisition and Sustainment Initiative, DICAS, with the US. I talk about the active defense diplomacy that Japan's undertaking, tightening security relations within the region, and particularly the sort of intense networking of the region in terms of security. So you have Japan-Philippines relations, Japan-India relations, Japan within the Quad, of course, US, Japan, Australia, and India, another innovation of Abe Shinzo, of course. Then we have Japan's deepening relations with NATO. I also take a brief look at new domains, cyber, space, and I look at intelligence too. In chapter 3, we look at new tools of security. Economics is now a domain of conflict. Economics and security are ever more closely intertwined. As I mentioned earlier, Yuka Koshino and I looked at Japan's geo-economic power a couple of years ago. Since we wrote that book, economic security has become more important within an overall ability to project geo-economic power. Japan has had a long history of thinking about economic security, partly because of its sort of scarcity of its own resources, and so on. But Japan's, I think, is now seen as if you like, because of this long history of thinking about economic security, as a bit of a thought leader in the area. So we look at Japanese initiatives in economic security and how they're being seen by others. Also, in Japan's sort of in effect in its security tools, we have these geo-economic channels. One which is the CPTPP, which is this mega trade bloc in the Asia Pacific, and that's now an important, or I think will increasingly become an important conduit for governance, supporting governance, supporting open trade, obviously very important now given what's coming out from the United States as well, and a very important initiative of Abe Shinzo again. Then we go into chapter 4 and the conclusion. So I've talked about the 5 pillars of comprehensive national power. This is how Japan desires to achieve its security. So the question now, the meat of the book, I think, in terms of the question is Japan able to meet the challenges that it set for itself? So there's two parts to the answer here. Yes, I argue yes, in terms of fulfilling the 4 major pillars of a successful deterrence strategy. Bill Emmett, in another Adelphi that was published last year, he talks about this as well. So these 4 pillars are political will, military capability, coalition credibility, and strategic messaging. And the previous 2 chapters, I think, deal with those. So I argue yes, in terms of deterrence, which is obviously the core of Japan's grand strategy, one of the cores. Japan possesses a formidable array of kit, and the lethality of Japan's armed forces is rising. So I think the threat component of deterrence and response is increasing. That is important again for the credibility of defense and response. Japan's also looking, as it says in the associated document with the 22 NSS, looking the defense build-up program. An important sentence here is focusing on the capabilities of our opponents and new ways of warfare. Again, very important for the credibility of deterrence and a departure from the old sort of position of maintaining a minimum level of defense needed, with the possibility of scaling up if needed. I also talk about Japan's latent nuclear power. I don't think this is on the cards yet, if ever, but I think it's always important to remember that Japan is a latent nuclear power. And again, if the listeners are interested in this, there's a great Adelphi volume again by our IISS colleague Mark Fitzpatrick, who talks in greater length about this. I also argue that Japan understands China better than anyone else. So I think it understands the nature of the threat. Japan has some of the world's best China analysts, I think, and these could be drawn on more widely. I think you're trying to understand, what China's thinking and so on. I think a good grand strategy needs an understanding of the nature of the problem. So I think Japan, because of its geographical position and its understanding of China, I think has that. However, there are some headwinds here. The 2 obvious ones, of course, and these don't just affect Japan, they also affect other countries in Europe and elsewhere. They're demographic, so falling population, aging population, and fiscal. Obviously, the fiscal positions of Japan and many other countries are under strain. But there are 2 more headwinds that I think affect Japan in particular. The first of these is the civilian-military gap in Japan. This has historical roots in Japan, born out of Japan's catastrophic defeat in 1945. Swathes of Japan's research community are reluctant to be involved in defense-related projects. The 2022 NSS makes a lot of the need for Japan to amplify its whole of society strengths to do what it needs to do. But of course, when you have this split, it does make this a bit more difficult. China, of course, North Korea, others have no problem with civil and military bits of society working together. And related to this, I think, is the sort of thinness, if you like, of Japanese strategic culture. And there's sort of the whole here, I think, is in the lack of the sort of a buoyant war studies scene, like we have, for example, in the UK and the US. And I think if you have having a war studies, a well-grounded, lively war studies scene means you focus on what it means to fight a war. You focus on your own experience of that as well, and so on. I think this is an important thing, not least for the ability of the government and so on to bring public opinion along with any decisions that may need to be made. One of our esteemed guests at one of our events, Mori Satoru Sensei, he put it very well. He talks about public opinion as the center of gravity of Japan's response to any Taiwan contingency. So having this building out, I think, this strategic culture, I think, is really important. And of course, the great Sir Michael Howard, as Ben will know, because you edited a wonderful Adelphi book on after Sir Michael's death. He described public opinion as one of the four tools of a country's grand strategy, the others being armed force, wealth, and allies. So just to end my words here, I think the strategic environment that Japan's facing is really intense. So I think the way that the government, in terms of the threat, I think the way that the Japanese government described this, which I quoted at the beginning, as severe and complex as it has ever been since the end of World War II, I think is absolutely right. But Japan has a history of responding to external shocks with rapid change. So we've talked about the Meiji Restoration, which I quote one expert who said that it's one of the most radical changes of national policy in recorded history, and they put it up there with the French Revolution as in sense of importance. Then of course we had the post-World War, the defeat in 1945, and I have a quote in the book from Miyazawa Kiichi, who was a grandee in Japanese politics and prime minister in the early 90s, of course. And he observed after 1945 that Japan had as much change in the 7 years of the occupation, the Allied occupation, as a normal country would have experienced in 100 years. So I wonder, and this I sort of, I don't know, it's just I throw it out there, whether there's sort of the intensity of the threat that Japan is facing, and like many others of us as well in Europe and elsewhere, maybe a spur to broader changes, perhaps economic reforms, other changes that may come in future years. So with that, Ben, I will hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for this really kind of both cogent and rich overview of your argument, and I think it will stimulate our audience greatly, and I can already see a number of questions coming through online. While more of our audience gather their strength to type into the keyboard, I might riff on a couple of points that you raised and see if we can think a little bit more about them. I was very struck by a few of the things you said. First of all, about the kind of historical comparison to the Meiji Restoration, which you may be worth 30 seconds of you just elaborating for the non-Japanologists in our virtual room about that. But in summary, it was a very highly significant moment in Japanese history. And I think your argument that today we might be requiring a kind of social or political shift of a comparable magnitude to meet the strategic challenges Japan now faces. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, how likely you think this kind of strategic impetus is likely to progress. You've already talked about some of the headwinds it's likely to meet, but perhaps a kind of overall feeling at the moment of where we're going on this. And also, in a related fashion, perhaps, to talk on something that you raised about strategic culture, this vital kind of component of what we're talking about. Because, of course, we can quantify things on paper about, kit or defense spending or a new department being established or whatever it is. But as you say, we're also talking about something cultural, societal, that's very important. And the cliche is, if one looks at, say, Russia and Italy, on paper, then they have a very similar GDP. But of course, the Russians are not Italians and the Italians are not Russians, to put it crudely. And I wonder if you could maybe riff a little bit about that point and what your evaluation at this stage is about, say, Japanese society, strategic culture, and I suppose a return to war thinking, to what extent that's possible, while obviously understanding the great cultural and understandable aversion to the horrors of militarism and where that might lead.
So two very rich and broad-ranging questions there, Ben. So thank you. So on the Meiji Restoration, it was a response to the threat to Japan from Western encroachment in Asia. which was coming ever closer to Japan, and of course the black ships of Commodore Perry coming into Tokyo Bay, Edo Bay, was obviously the proximate trigger. But basically, Japan sort of reinvented itself institutionally, politically. Started to industrialize. Lots of things happened, and it was a real, really sort of pragmatic response to a perceived external threat, which I think obviously there in the sort of pluses and minuses to the way Japan behaved in the region as a result, partly of that. But the sort of basic one can date Japan's modernization from that period, and there was some disruption, volatility, obviously domestically in Japan, but it was really accomplished with quite an impressive degree of efficiency with the with that generation of leaders within Japan. In terms of the and of course the major leaders, as I said in my opening remarks, they took a conscious decision to align themselves with the prevailing international order, which was led by the great maritime powers, the UK, and then of course increasingly the US. In terms of how this strategic impetus progresses, I think there's that's another way of saying, is this the changes that we've been outlining, how sustainable are they? And if you'd have asked perhaps 10 years ago, I would say that I would be a little bit ambivalent. But we fast forward 10 years now, and all the things that have happened since then externally. So of course you have the rise of China, which of course Japan felt more intensely, I think, than many other countries, because it's a neighbor. And in 2010, Japan was overtaken as the second largest economy by China. So there was a specifically Japan anxiety there, I think. And then of course you have the Japan's response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and of course that had a direct impact on Japan because of the dispute that Japan has with Russia over the northern territories just north of Hokkaido. So there are sort of things coming in that Japan feels quite sort of close proximity, I think, geographically, and of course one can't leave out North Korea. So Japan has missiles being tested in its direction, and a couple of times have overflown Japan. And of course this is does add to anxiety. That's one thing. The other thing, I think, is the shift in perception in the Japanese public towards China. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was a generally positive feeling, I feel, towards China. There's historic links, cultural links, and so on. But you've really seen that change over recent years, partly because of the clear anti-Japanese demonstrations that we've had in China, concerns about Taiwan, concerns around China's intentions towards the Senkaku Islands down in the not far off Taiwan as well. So all of these things, I think, have shifted public opinion in the sense of understanding more what the challenges are, and I think that is important for as a key sort of vehicle for sustaining the strategic trajectory emotionally. I think there are obviously some issues around how this is paid for, and that is not just an issue for Japan. That's obviously an issue for us in the UK, elsewhere in NATO as well. But I think my sense is that the strategic impetus, as you put it, Ben, is now there. And of course, there will be moments when the strategic trajectory is accelerated, and moments when it goes more slowly. But I don't see a return to the days, sort of, if you like, pre-Abe Shinzo's second term, which was 2012 to 2020. That was such an important watershed in terms of policy, in terms of how Japan thought of itself, and I think that has sort of put down quite deep roots. And then your second question was around strategic culture and Japanese society and so on. So I think it's important to note when one's trying to sort of think about this, the impact of the occupation in 1945, 1952. And of course, it was quite, so some areas where the impact was deeper than others. One of them was in education, and obviously there was a big effort to change the way that Japanese youth were educated, and that has left deep roots in Japanese society, partly, of course, through to work with on defence matters. That said, I think that the nature of Japanese society, the statement of the obvious, is changing. You no longer see, for example, and this again, we see this in Europe, you no longer see the sort of big cleft between left and right that you had when I first went to Japan back in 1989. That was still a thing. That sort of ideological cleft that has gone. I think Japanese young people, they look at Japan, they've grown up with a different view of China, they've grown up with a different external environment. So there are lots of sort of things, there's generational change, as I said, there's the way that China's behaving, as I said. So there's lots of things that I think that are sort of leading to changes in Japan that I think personally are needed. But I think the need to focus on what it means to fight a war, because that obviously is a massive thing. I think that focus, I think, needs to sort of come into, so heave a bit more into view sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Robert. Excellent. We're now I could ask many more questions, but I think I need to turn to the wave of questions that is reaching us digitally. I may try and kind of blend a couple of them in, which are touching on similar questions. So my apologies in advance to anyone who asked this, because I've done an injury to the detail, but I'll do my best. We've had a comment and a question from Chris Hughes, also a distinguished Japanologist and one of our treasured former Adelphi authors, who says very kind things about your book, but also touches on the fact that in your talk today there was very little discussion of the United States and particularly the Trump administration and the impact of the Trump administration on Japan. And he asked whether this kind of relatively limited focus on the context of the US-Japan alliance, is this a deliberate choice that you're making to indicate a view that you see Japan has more agency than we think typically beyond the alliance, or will have to exercise more autonomy, given recent developments of the Trump administration? And a related question from Kanish Kanodia, our friends at Chatham House down the road, asking essentially, yes, how central is American extended security to Japanese grand strategy? And how credible will Japan's kind of threat toolkit be without an American extended security guarantee? There are many others coming in along those variants, and I'll see if I can pass them for more nuance, but I thought I might lob those two in your general direction to start off.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Chris, for your question. Again, Chris written two great Adelphis, actually, which I think I drew on and quoted in mine, so also very worth reading. Thank you to both our questioners for wheeling the United States into the room. Yes, you're absolutely right. I blame it on the heat of today. I should have made more of that. I mean, as you imply, and as is in fact, the relationship with the security relation for Japan, the security relationship with the US is this anchor of foreign policy. I think this is the unchangeable constant that Japan has to constantly nurture in terms of its foreign policy, and other things I think come from that. I think without that alliance, the security alliance, Japan-US security alliance, I think Japan's strategic position within Asia would be obviously very, very different. I think so in my talk, and again, thank you for picking me up on the omission of the other bit of why Japan is doing all the stuff that it's doing. I focused on the concerns about China and the concerns about Taiwan, but that's one concern. Obviously, the other concern that Tokyo has is increasing its agency within the US alliance, because if you think about the history of the Japan-US alliance over sort of many years, in the old days, sort of ambivalent, sort of waving between two fears. One is entrapment in a US military operation or war that Japan may not want to be in. Another one was abandonment, sort of being abandoned by the US in the region. And of course, US, as you will know, Ben, from your US history expertise, the US has constantly fluctuated between wanting to be engaged in various regions and then not wanting that. So I think now the overwhelming fear is of abandonment in the US. I think entrapment is less of a fear given that the geopolitical risk to Japan from anything that happens in Taiwan. So I think abandonment is the key driver here, and all the things you're saying are also directed at just trying to keep the US interested, trying to improve the interoperability of Japan and the US in many ways, organizationally, in terms of kit and so on. And I know, Chris, you've written very interestingly on that very subject. Again, with American extended deterrence, absolutely critical, and of course not just for Japan, also for South Korea. And if there's any doubt that arises over the credibility, reliability of US extended deterrence, for example, in South Korea, there's quite a lively debate within South Korea about whether South Korea should acquire its own nuclear weapons capability. And of course, if South Korea were to go along that road, then that obviously would have implications for Japan as well. So for both Japan and the US, both Japan and South Korea, extended deterrence from the US is absolutely critical. So thank you both for for making me talk a bit more about the US.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to turn now to a question from Alexandra Sakaki of SVP in Berlin, who asked whether you might be able to say a little bit more about the civilian-military gap that you discussed. And she argues it seems there are new efforts to overcome that gap, and resistance to cooperate in the dual-use research field is also declining. How do you see this developing?
So one of the things that really, and hello, Alexandra, nice. Thank you for joining. Alexandra also contributed to one of our fantastic events, the one that at Japan House, actually. So nice to have you on the call, Alexandra. So one of the things I think that really that was not widely commented on in the National Security Strategy 2022 one was the sort of constant refrain in the document to this narrowing this civilian military gap, whether it's in terms of technology research, whether it's in terms of trying to enlist public opinion, for public support rather, for hardening of port infrastructure or other infrastructure changes that are needed, and so on. So I think so. I thought that was extremely telling, because it showed that this was a strategic concern in the Japanese government, and one that actually we referred to, Yuka and I referred to in our previous Adelphi as well. But your point on dual use research, for example, is important, because I wonder actually whether dual use as a term really is particularly useful now, because almost all technology is dual use. So perhaps we will see a sort of convergence there in between the sort of natural convergence, if you like, between the civilian and military sides in Japanese research community and so on, because so much of civilian technology also has a military use. That said, I think it will take quite a long time. The resistance is still there in the research community. So there'll be a lot of need for more persuasion, cajoling, and so on. But without these two coming together, I think Japan is it can't fully realize its sort of national potential in terms of dealing with the external threats.
Thank you, Robert. And I'd like to maybe now pose a question which is perhaps related from Swarup Gupta of your former location, the Economist Group.
Yes.
And they're asking about essentially your assessment of Japan's defense industry, and specifically whether it's going to be able to gain the trust of major importers like India in its quest for expansion. And with the understanding that you're not a defense kit expert, but still this does obviously bear to the idea of Japan as a strategic actor. I was wondering whether you might have any thoughts about that.
So it's a good question because and thank you, Swarup. Nice that you've joined us as well. It's a very good question because it goes to the heart of the need to build build out Japan's defense industrial base. So really, until now, Japanese defense companies they've served they've provided products and so on for the Japanese Ministry of Defense. That was all defined and all within Japan, but they haven't really had as much international exposure as perhaps would be needed to build scale, to get know-how and so on. Which is why the GCAP program that I mentioned between Japan, UK, and Italy, why it's so important, why the changes that Japan's made to allow more exports of security equipment, again, very important for sort of building Japan's domestic defense base. Why the efforts of Japan's defense firms to work more broadly outside Japan, why they're so important. There's a big hill to climb still, I think, but Japan does have expertise in certain key areas. One area to watch would be any cooperation between Japan and AUKUS, for example. That would be very welcome, I think, in of itself, but also Japan would have a big role to play in contributing to that too in areas in the sort of Pillar 2. So. Very important that Japan builds its defense industrial base. Very important that its defense companies get more sort of international activity. And also important, I think, that the sector itself domestically is sort of built up. It's been allowed to atrophy. A number of companies, I quote a figure in the book, sort of left the sector. It's quite fragmented, quite small scale. So all of these things are important to deal with, and more interaction with countries like India and obviously NATO and so on, I think will all be to the good to allow Japan to achieve its ambitions here.
Thank you very much, Robert. I should mention that my colleagues are very helpfully also passing to me a succession of questions that were being asked on the LinkedIn platform, which is carrying this webinar, this broadcast. One of them that I'd like to turn to now is by Leander Holveg, which touches on, I suppose, an issue which I can see in a number of other questions, which would be interesting to hear your views on. Essentially, it is, what are we seeing now between China and Japan, given the rather, how can I put it, dynamic policy shifts coming from Washington related to tariffs? To what extent is this tariff policy alienating Japan from Washington? And can we observe any kind of sign of things changing in the in the China-Japan relationship? I believe that there was recently a partial lifting of a Japanese ban on Japanese seafood imports. And I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that.
So thank you, Leander, for that question. It touches slightly on the questions at the start around Japan and the US. I think that is the unmovable core of Japan's security policy, more broadly, probably foreign policy as well. But as I talk in the book, that Japan has to navigate this sort of quite difficult triangle between the US, China and Russia, and of course formerly the Soviet Union. So with regard to China and Japan, as I said, I think to one of Ben's questions, I think the concerns about China, I think now in terms of the threat that they pose to that China poses to potential threat that China poses within the region, are now quite put down deep roots in Japanese public opinion. But so there is a sort of high threat perception about China as a neighbor to Japan. But I think also important in Japanese foreign policy, and again, Abe-san put it very well when in his 2006 book, and again, I quote this in the Adelphi book, Utsukushi Kunie, Towards a Beautiful Country, when he said that China-Japan relations are inseverable. I think it was kitemo kirenai gokei no kankei. So that's really sort of puts it very succinctly, that even though China is a threat, increasingly more so, that Abe-san also saw, relations between Japan and China are actually inseparable as well, and that has lots of reasons, not least economic. So fast forward to now, clearly Japan is being buffeted on the tariff front by President Trump. I've written elsewhere that I think Japan is probably in a better position to deal with American unpredictability, largely because it's had long years of experience of this, whether it's President Nixon in the Nixon shocks of 1971, or whether it's the Reagan Japan bashing that Prime Minister Nakasone navigated in the 1980s, or the Japan passing of the 1990s under President Clinton. So Japan, it doesn't obviously enjoy these experiences, but actually I think it is well prepared, sort of emotionally, if you like, to deal with this. So I think, given all of that, China obviously is looking for a sort of wedging potential to split Japan's ire around US tariffs. I think Japan is, and so China, as you said, Ben, has partially lifted a seafood ban and so on. I think Japan responds to that pragmatically. So obviously the relations are inseverable. It needs relations to be good. It has economic interests. But that doesn't signal a core change in how Japan views the region or how Japan views the United States. So Japan is being pragmatic, realistic about relations with China at the moment, but any sort of friendlier warming of tones doesn't, I think, impact the way that Japan views China, the threat to it. You have the Senkaku Islands I talked about. We have the Taiwan issue, other issues as well, or the primacy of the US alliance.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'd like to turn to another question we have via LinkedIn, actually from Hassan Al-Hassan, one of our colleagues, who himself is, I think, busily writing an Adelphi as we speak. And his question relates to the Middle East and to what extent the Middle East may feature in Japan's new grand strategy. We'll recall in the recent war with Iran that there were murmurings about the Straits of Hormuz being closed. And my recollection, although it may be outdated, is that Japan gets quite a lot of its energy from the Middle East. I was wondering to what extent you feel, Robert, in your discussions with senior policymakers in Japan and your research, to what extent does the Middle East feature in Japanese grand strategy, and what are they going to do about it, to put it crudely?
Well, Hassan, thank you for joining. A good question, and good luck with your Adelphi as well. The Middle East clearly really important to Japan, perhaps more so than perhaps you put Japan and South Korea in the same bucket here. But Japan's dependence on the Middle East is for resources, for oil, hydrocarbons, absolutely large. And there have been efforts to reduce this over the years, but still it is Japan is very, very vulnerable in terms of energy security to anything that happens in the US. And that's why I think during the years of Abe Shinzo, you had Abe-san was so engaged in the region, even going I think to Iran at one point. Obviously not successfully, but engaged. So Middle East critically important for Japan. Japan's quite invested, I think, in trying to think of new forms of energy technology. Working with Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on that, working with others as well. Japan has I suspect is among the G7 is the most energy vulnerable, given its scarcity of resources, given where it is as well. Unlike in, say, Europe, that we can't sort of share it, that Japan can't share electricity with the continent in Asia. Obviously, that puts Japan again at a disadvantage. So, to Hassan's question, very important efforts to reduce the vulnerability, I think, they are there, but they haven't had as much impact perhaps as policymakers would hope. I suspect that in the long term, because of this, and because of this vulnerability on energy, that Japan's nuclear program, civilian nuclear program, I think will develop more over the years, because this, of course, is one way to reduce the vulnerability to what's going on in the Middle East.
Thank you, Robert. I'm mindful we've only got a few minutes left, but I want to squeeze in one last question from Professor Takuya Matsuda at, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, Aoyama Gakuin University in Japan, who essentially touches on the modernization of alliance command and control, which is a key part of the US-Japan agenda. But he touches on the kind of the tension inherent within this, because a closer integration with US armed forces also comes at the cost of Japan's strategic autonomy, strategic agency. How do you see Japan kind of balancing it between this alliance requirement and maintaining a strategic autonomy? I realize that's a very large question to speak about for a couple of minutes, but I thought I'd put it in your direction.
Well, and another good. Thank you, Takuya, for joining this session as well. Nice again. Another also Takuya has contributed to our I think a Japan memo, one of our episodes, which was fantastic. So, well, this I think goes to the heart of the trade-offs that Japan. If what I've said about the primacy of the US-Japan alliance is right, which I think it is, then from that flow a number of decisions that Japan has to make around strategic autonomy, around dual use, and all of that. So, if that's the case, then there are some trade-offs that Japan won't have much option but to undertake. I think to answer that question, you have to sort of step back a bit in terms of the how viable the trade-offs are. I think Japan, with regard to Taiwan, China doesn't fear, I suspect, Japan on its own. The sort of asymmetry of power is just too great, but it does fear the US and Japan working together. So I suspect that Japan's policymakers, obviously, because it's got myriad levels, I suspect they're looking at these trade-offs, and there is inherent in the importance of the US treaty alliance a trade-off on strategic autonomy as well. But I think it comes back to the point I made on abandonment, I think, being the prime concern now, much more than entrapment, and perhaps that has fewer. That makes this particular trade-off perhaps a bit more palatable. I would say I think Takuya has also written a good article in Survival as well. So yeah, worth reading.
Thank you very much for keeping to time, Robert, and also for that shout out to Survival. I think we could probably talk for at least another hour. There are enough interesting questions extant, and I'm sure Robert would be able to do that without flagging. But unfortunately, we do only have this hour, and we're now coming up against it. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and for asking such excellent and pertinent questions. I do hope that anyone who would like to will go and purchase this fine book, which can be found on Amazon and Routledge, of course. And as I said, there is a 20% discount code off, which I hope you'll be able to take advantage of. I would like to thank all my colleagues again for helping to bring this into the world. But most of all, I'd like to thank Robert not just for his excellent presentation today and his wonderful fielding of all these questions, but most of all for writing the book and writing it in a very timely and excellent and cogent manner. And it was a delight to work with him on this. So thank you so much, Robert, for joining us.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, everyone. And with that,